We just got one of League's best comics. It reveals the new champion, it has godly lore, all puns intended, and it is 10 minutes long. It felt like I was watching a mini episode of Arcane. Not to mention, the animations in the comics are getting fancy. But yes, yesterday we got hit with a massive lore bomb, where out of nowhere we got the new comic called The Truth, which overall serves as a setup for the final season of this year. And oh boy, what a setup it is! And so, without further ado, let's start munching on all the awesome lore, just to give us all the context we might need. The comic begins with a quick TLDR of the story that happened so far. Essentially, after many years of no spirit blossoming happening because of the Noxian invasion, they finally returned, and somehow Xin Zhao managed to get his own wild bloom to blossom in Demacia, which should be impossible, and so he decided to travel to Ionia to see what happened. There he met Master Kennen, who invited him to the Temple of Koshin, which is where demons started attacking a nearby town. All of that happened in the minigame that we played, where Xin Zhao and Yunara defeated the demons, fighting game style. But then they heard the alarm coming from the Temple of Twilight, which is where Yunara's patron, who was one of the Darkin, was sealed. Because as was teased before, it seems like LeBlanc used the demons as a distraction to invade the temple. So currently, Yunara and Xin Zhao are rushing back to the temple to see what happened. And that is where this comic starts. We have Yunara pushing them all towards the temple. However, Xin Zhao got stopped by something odd. He witnessed visions of a fallen Demacia. Of course, this is referencing the skins which we are getting in the game. Specifically, visions of the fallen Jarvan and Garen. As to what these visions are even doing here, well, that is a mystery. Because everyone present got confused by these visions. And so naturally Xin Zhao asked who would be so powerful to cause these. Kennen hesitated because to reveal who actually caused these visions would mean he would have to reveal a Koshin secret. But after we learned that Yunara trusts Xin Zhao because they fought side by side, Kennen spilled the beans. And so, Kennen asks Xin Zhao what he knows about the Darkin, and that is where something really cool happens. Because in this scene, Xin Zhao essentially acts as us, and he talks about the lore that we know about the Darkin. He essentially told Kennen what the players know, which would be the general Darkin overview. So he talked about how they were monsters from an ancient time that waged war across the world. That would be the Darkin Wars. And because Xin Zhao studied a lot of Demacian history, or at least I assume so, he also mentioned how there was a Darkin who attacked ancient Demacia, where the Winged Protectors saved them all after their battle soon after the Rune Wars. Here he is referencing the battle between Aatrox and Gale and Morgana, which is a scene all of you may remember from the cinematic still here. Also, it is cool how Xin Zhao calls ancient Demacians the children of Orlon, because Orlon, who was the original wielder of Poppy's hammer, is the person who founded Demacia. Anyway, after this little segment, Kennen mentions that all of these are just stories. And oftentimes, stories cover a darker truth that actually happened. Which is also the case for Ionia. Because while Xin Zhao was talking about the story of the devoted maiden, which is what we talked about last time, the real story that happened was quite different. And so, Yunara tells us what really happened here. The comic sets up the scene as 15 centuries ago. And looking at the timeline of this universe, it checks out. This was the time of the Great Darkin War. Here Yunara mentions that nobody knew why the Darkin arrived in Ionia. But soon after they did, they gathered a lot of followers. And they managed to destroy everything in their path. Koshin was the last Kinku stronghold that was still standing. And as you can see here, it too was attacked by a Darkin. Specifically, from the setup we got in the previous comic, this Darkin should be Pra, the Darkin who would eventually be turned into a Darkin fan. Which is where we also have to mention one more thing. It is not every time that a Darkin gets sealed inside their own weapon. For example, here you can see that Pra had some kind of a blade, but eventually they became a fan anyway. And later you will potentially see another example of this. Anyway, just as the Ionians prayed to the shrine spirits, their savior arrived. An uncorrupted Darkin, which is someone whom we know by many names. The Ascended, the Golden God Warriors, but Yunara called him a god of the Third Land. Now this is a really cool reference because, of course, to Ionians, Ionia is called the First Lands. And while this was never explained, it was always assumed that they call Ionia the First Lands because, historically, while we don't know where humans really came from, in the old lore book, it was mentioned that there was a great eastern migration, where all the mortals who inhabited this world were somewhere in the east and they migrated to the west. Which means that humans likely come from the old Kamavoran continent. But that of course means that they arrived in Ionia first, hence why First Lands. And since the Shuriman continent is the Third Land, we can assume that Valoran is the Second Land. Anyway, up to this point, the Darkin were always considered enemies of Ionia. But then the hero arrived, who cleaved Pra in twain, and destroyed an entire army of Darkin followers on his own. After which, he introduced himself as Zahen, which is most likely our official introduction of the new champion. And as you can see, if you have a look at their blade, it matches the one that Atakan has in the game now. Curious. Anyway, here, Zahen told everyone that the Darkin were originally the Ascended who fought for the Shuriman Emperor. But over time, he witnessed how the Ascended turned towards the darkness. Which is a really fancy way to avoid telling us what actually happened. Because we know that the Ascended became the Darkin after Emperor Azir got backstabbed, their minds got broken by the Void during the war for Icathia, and they all got corrupted by blood that came from an Ascended who tried to bind everyone. Which means that in order for Zahen to stay pure, he likely never encountered that one specific Darkin before, and potentially he didn't fight in the war with Icathia. But yes, long story short, the Ascended fell towards the darkness. And as he mentioned, Ionia was yet another battlefield to them. Because during the Great Darkin Wars, the Darkin fought for dominance because they didn't have an emperor. Which is where we get a really cool detail. Yunara said Zahen could stand by no longer. He felt responsible. I think. By this, the comic is referencing what I just said. That he, as an Ascended, was part of the problem that would eventually become the Darkin. But here he pulls out a really deep lore cut. Because this is the Chalikar, which is the blade many of you may know as Sivir's weapon. Which is a big reference to the story called The Twilight of the Gods. In this story, after a lot of the Darkin gathered to negotiate about the war, they all got jumped by the aspect of Twilight, who used the Chalikar as a conduit for celestial magic and annihilated all the present Darkin. After this, the aspect of Twilight taught mortals how to seal the Darkin inside their weapons. Which is exactly what this parchment is. This piece of paper is what was spread around the world to give the mortals a chance to fight back. This is essentially a manual for sealing the Darkin, which is also why at the bottom of the parchment you can see a symbol that is very close to Diana's moon. This is because that night that the first Darkin were annihilated, the aspect of Twilight used the power of the moon to destroy them. Because the moon is the other side of the sun, which created the Ascended in the first place. In fact, during the scene where everyone died, they died with this battle cry: "What the sun made, the moon will unmake." And so, carrying this message around the world, Zahen traveled around Ionia slaying as many Darkin as he could. This is what made the Kinku consider him an ally, but they still had to play it safe. This too could have been a Darkin trick. So the ultimate judgment, as always in these situations, came to the Eye of Twilight. The person who is essentially the Kinku judge, who is all about keeping everything in equilibrium. Of course, we know the Eye of Twilight as Shen, but of course, this is many years ago, and so it was someone else. Unfortunately, we don't know their name, but we can see them making a pact with Zahen. After this, Yunara was allowed to team up with Zahen to defeat the other Darkin. And here it is cool to see how the original myth wasn't that far away from the truth. It's just that the good Darkin was actually a proper Ascended. Regardless, in these scenes we can see all the Darkin that Zahen defeated. And what's cool is that we know them all. First up we have, who seems to be, Rast. We know this because Rast was referenced in the original myth, and while everyone else in this comic is a Darkin we've seen before, Rast was the only one missing, so by the process of elimination, that should be Rast. Though if you look closer, I'm not exactly sure if he's holding a scythe. In the original myth, he did, so maybe this is just a weird angle. But it is possible that he's just holding a different weapon. I mean, this is the Pra situation that I was talking about. So it can still be Rast. Also, look at how cool the original battle armor of the Eye of Twilight is. Can Shen get this as a skin, please? Anyway, next, Zahen also defeated Varus. Here you can see all the Ionian spirits reaching for him. This is a really cool reference to the original cinematic for Varus. I'll be honest, that's pretty cool. You can also see that he is being shoved down that well that you can find in Pallas. Of course, that one was also part of the cinematic. And you can even see that Varus is holding his original bow. With that said, there is something that should be mentioned here. Technically, this is a retcon, because in Varus's new lore, that is also pretty old now, he wasn't sealed in Ionia, he was brought here by someone who then put him down that well. But I will let this retcon pass, because that story that was established there didn't really connect to anything else that happened. Maybe outside of the Twilight of the Gods story. So with this retcon, it's not like much changed. Also, hey, Arcane was mentioned! Jokes aside, I saw some people confused by the mention of Arcane. And I can tell you, Arcane knowledge is a reference to Zahen knowing about this incomprehensible magic, since it technically comes from the Celestial Realms, which could be a reference to Arcane in and of itself. But after this, there is a very special Darkin. Looking at the two blades, you can see that this is what Zolani originally looked like. Which means this scene is very important. You see, Zolani is the Darkin who corrupted everyone else with blood magic. Her original plan was to give hemomancy to all the Darkin with the promise of power. But later she would use it to bind all the Ascended to her will. That would be an effective way to stop everyone from fighting, while also becoming their god. Unfortunately, she never got to the second phase of her plan. She only managed to give the Ascended hemomancy, which is what was the key turning point for them becoming the Darkin. That's when they started using blood magic to morph their own bodies to be stronger. But she never got the chance to use hemomancy to control everyone. The reason why this is especially important here is because here you can see Zolani trying to corrupt Zahen. Now, Zahen still defeats her and seals her in her blades. We also know that this is the case because of Legends of Runeterra, but he couldn't do it without getting tainted. Remember this for now. And while all of this was happening, in the background, Yunara was preparing for the worst. With every defeated Darkin, she studied them to make sure that she could defeat Zahen should he ever betray them. And in the final scene, we can see Zahen holding up the Scythe of Rast. So was this the Rast that was shown in the first image here? I guess. Anyway, after all the Darkin were defeated, which means that Zahen has to be incredibly powerful, the Eye of Twilight passed her judgment, and since he honored their pact, Zahen would be allowed to go in peace. But Zahen wouldn't allow it. He started feeling his humanity fading, and he feared he would eventually become a Darkin too. While the comic never confirmed it, it is all but guaranteed that this happened because of his previous encounter with Zolani, who likely tainted him. And so, Zahen willingly asked to be banished, just like all the other Darkin. He wanted to be placed somewhere where mortals could never reach him. And so, he was placed into the Temple of Twilight, which was pushed into the spirit realm, with Yunara going there with him, because she was the one who knew how to defeat him. Now, after learning about this story, Xinjiao got confused because in the original Ionian myth, the maiden followed the patron into the spirit realm out of her devotion, while in reality, Yunara was there to keep Zahen in check. She was essentially his jailer. So Xin asked why keep all of this a secret from the rest of Ionia. And Kennen told him they didn't have time. Ionia had to heal, and so it was better to tell everyone a wholesome story. The twist is, they all realized that someone had to know the true story, because someone used the demons as a distraction while they invaded the Temple of Twilight. Who could that be? Anyway, during this time, Yunara told Xin to board his vessel and go back home to warn Demacia that the Darkin have returned. But Xinjiao refused. The Darkin were a threat to the entire world, so he would stay here to keep Zahen imprisoned, while still staying in service to Demacia. So they all return to Koshin, where they meet another member of the Kinku. Unfortunately, we don't know their name, but inevitably they ask, where is Shen? The question that all Shen mains have been asking the entire time. And so Yunara told us that Shen is simply far away, and so they have to do it without him. That's the reasoning. So Kennen proposed that they would round up the acolytes and bring them to the temple. But the issue was that the Temple of Twilight was gone again. It was back in the spirit realm. And since it was in the spirit realm, the only way to enter would be through the Trials of Twilight. And so the name of the season has been finally mentioned. Anyway, the Trials of Twilight were like a magical lock that was enforced by the Eye of Twilight. This is why it was that person who was making all the pacts. They have incredible control over the spirit realm. Kennen warned them that only one or two can enter the trials at the same time. Any more and they would be rejected. And since Kennen is the one who has to stay outside because he's the one who can pull them out of the trials afterwards, it was Yunara and Xinjiao who had to go in. But not before we went through some preparations. And so Kennen called for the Woodweavers. And I would like to say, I told you so! When they first teased the skin, it was obvious some kind of Ionian woodweaving was at present. But unfortunately here they just give him his armor that's now made out of wood, without the help of a woodweaver. But the woodweaving comes in later and it's a really cool part. Anyway, Xinjiao had to take off his original Demacian armor because it was made out of petricite, with petricite being the Demacian material that has the ability to dull magic. Of course, this wouldn't work because the Trials of Twilight are all about spirit magic. And so that is a really cool way to make up an excuse to make a skin. But yes, the Trials would test their spirits to see if their intentions are honorable. And so they clad him in a Kinku outfit and his arm started glowing. I'll be honest, that one still wasn't really explained. We can just assume that the Ionian spirits favored him. I thought there would be something more behind that. But then we get to the really cool woodweaving part. Because next, they take Xinjiao's broken spear, which, as you may remember from the previous minigame, got stuck inside the body of a demon, and they also took Xinjiao's original sapling. This is the one that started Xinjiao's entire storyline in the first comic. And now, the woodweaver evoked nature magic to grow it into a tree, with the tree extending the branch, which would become a new handle for a new spear. I have to say, that is kinda badass. And so, ready for the Trials of Twilight, Kennen opens up the gate into the spirit realm. The two hop in and they are immediately separated. And Xinjiao ends up in a vision of Viscero, which was the name of the original fishing boat where he was when he got ambushed by Noxians during the Noxian invasion. Of course, that is when he got kidnapped and he got brought into Noxus. In other words, this was the very beginning of Xinjiao's entire story. But to us, this was also the beginning of the Trials of Twilight, which is where the story unfortunately ends. And now we kinda just have to wait, I guess. Because this has been an absolutely amazing comic. And I had to go online and I had to look at the reactions, and yep, I'm not the only one who thinks this. Thankfully, the reception is really cool, and now there are a lot of people who are excited for League's lore. Who would have thought? And I'll be honest, I have also not been this excited for a story in a while. The setup for Zahen as a new champion is amazing, even though I still don't think this is what Zahen is gonna look like in the game. Because Atakan still has to get his glaive, and so there's gonna be some kind of twisting happening. And suspiciously enough, LeBlanc has been missing the entire time. I wonder what kind of plot twist is gonna happen. But most importantly, since this all ends so abruptly, this has to be a setup for a new comic, or a new cinematic, or a new minigame. Who knows, maybe there's gonna be a game mode or something. But it is obvious that something is happening, and that something is already very exciting. But I have to say, even though I am freaking out, let's not keep our hopes too high. There is no way they are setting up the MMO, right?